All right, here we are again. We got a lot of stuff to cover today. I want to try to make it as quick as I can, but we're talking about the 1850s, and in the 1850s, a lot of stuff happened. And let's face it, when we're talking about history and you say a lot of stuff happened, it's usually not good stuff. So this might be a good time to press pause and go get a sandwich, and then come back. Okay, you must be back. All right, so what we're going to talk about today is the breakdown of compromise. This is lecture 25. For up to this point, the country has been able to come together and hold itself together through a process of compromise, whether it was the Great Compromise or the Three-Fifths Compromise or the Missouri Compromise. The country has been able to hold itself together as a result of compromise. And yet, this system of compromise is simply not going to work anymore. And what happened? Why does it not work? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, to get ourselves moving, of course, there's always an essential question or an essential task that we want to accomplish, and this is to analyze the reasons for the failure of efforts to hold the Union together, which corresponds with Key Concepts 5.2.2. So, moving right along. First, we want to talk a little bit about the abolitionists. We've already talked about them for the most part, so I'm not going to dwell on the abolitionists all that much. But by the 1850s, the abolitionists are going to have a significant voice in the United States. Now, this is kind of impressive, considering the fact that the abolitionists were by far a minority opinion. Even in the North, the abolitionists were a minority opinion. But this was a very popular opinion among American cultural elites. The people who write the books and create the artwork and things along those lines, they tended to be abolitionists. So we had a very vocal minority, a minority that, even though they didn't have the numbers, could get their message out and be heard, which is the definition of a vocal minority. So we have some examples. Many of the famous authors of the times held abolitionist opinions and feelings, and they wrote about them. Herman Melville, Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, of course, Frederick Douglass, and let's face it, probably the most influential of all was Harriet Beecher Stowe and her very, very popular book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which highlighted and really emphasized and pushed forward the brutality under which slaves lived and existed. This was a bestseller of the time, and it really brought a lot of people into the abolitionist cause and made it very difficult for people who were not necessarily sympathetic toward the abolitionists to speak against them. How could you speak in favor of such brutal treatment as was put into Uncle Tom's Cabin? So the goal isn't always necessarily to get people to embrace your position. Sometimes when a movement like the abolitionist movement, the goal is to get folks who don't agree to shut up. And that's pretty much what books like Uncle Tom's Cabin did. We also had a growing number of abolitionist politicians. Especially we're going to talk a little bit later on, in this newly formed party called the Republican Party is going to become kind of home for some of these abolitionists. Some of them will be even radical abolitionists. They'll be later on become known as the Radical Republicans. Churches were involved in this, and this is going to be very significant because many churches were national churches like the Baptist Church and the Methodist churches. And what ended up happening is oftentimes these churches, kind of in a presage of what was going to happen to the country, these churches split, for instance, and we ended up with northern versions of the Baptist Church and southern Baptist churches that didn't necessarily hold to the abolitionist creed. However, churches like the Society of Friends, the Unitarian Church, these were churches that were very, very active in the abolitionist movement and trying to fight and combat what they saw as the evils of slavery. Among the things that these churches organized helped organize was the Underground Railroad. This was also organized by a large number of freed blacks in the North. And we talked about the Underground Railroad earlier, so again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we have a lot to do. But the Underground Railroad was a secret system by which escaped slaves, could escape and get to free territory. Well, during this time, the Southern response to the Underground Railroad was absolute outrage. Look, it's in the Constitution. You have to return the slaves. There's a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. You got to do it. So what the Southerners really wanted to see as a result of this Underground Railroad was a stronger penalties on people who helped runaway slaves, and greater efforts to take down the people on the Underground Railroad like Harriet Tubman and make them stop doing what they're doing. They wanted stronger laws to protect their right to what they believed was their property. Adjust the light here a little bit. So now the problem here of course, is it was the Southern claim that states' rights took priority over federal power. So how do you then ask the federal government to assert power over a state's right to harbor slaves? The Constitution did not provide for this. So this is going to become a real problem with the states' rights argument, and there's a large movement to frame the Civil War as not a war about slavery as much as a war about states' rights and abuses of federal power. But hopefully by the end of this lecture you will see that slavery was the key issue, and that states' rights was at best maybe a secondary matter, a secondary issue, and certainly was not a consistent issue with regard to the factors that were going on in the 1850s. Slavery is ultimately what's going to bring to cause the Civil War. It really hits the fan in 1849, and what happens in 1849? Well, a couple of miners in California find this little yellow metal substance, and turns out it's gold. So what we want to do is we want to be be really quiet. Don't tell anybody we found gold. So literally within minutes, well, it's not literally, it's figuratively literally. But anyway, within minutes, the word gets to everybody in the country that there's gold found in California, and of course a massive number of people start to move into California to find gold, almost none of whom actually find gold. But gold is found, and there will be an increase of gold in the country. But the vast majority of the prospectors who went out to California saying California or bust, well, they busted. So they go out there, and well, before you know it, there's an awful lot of people in California, largely located up in the northern region of California, and California decides to enter into the Union as a free state. Most of the people who went there were not burdened with bringing their slaves with them. California was also a former Mexican territory, which did not have slaves, and California wants to enter into the country as a free state. Problem, right? Well, we have this Missouri Compromise that did draw this 3630 line, and let's see how that works out. Uh-oh. Well, we can't really use the Missouri Compromise in this case. We can't extend it beyond the former Louisiana Territory. Well, what do? And the reality is that California was very valuable real estate. We were going to benefit from this territory as becoming a state. It was great farming. There were some great ports, San Francisco, for instance. These were great ports to access markets in China. We want California to come in as a state, but there's no way that Southern politicians, Southern senators, are going to vote to allow California to come into the country as a state. There were no other areas open that could compensate for this. Maybe we could have split California in half, but that would have been a problem because most of the population in California was located in the northern regions. So this was a huge, huge problem. And another thing that we have going on is our guys who were responsible for the previous compromise, the Compromise of Missouri. Well, let's face it. I mean, you can kind of take a look at them here. They're a bit out of sorts. They've gotten quite old. more power to them, but these guys were on their way out. This was their last great, political adventure. We're moving into a time where a new generation is taking the leadership and taking the reins of the political system, like Stephen Douglas of the Democratic Party and William Seward in the Whig Party. Some major changes were happening to the Second American party system. The Democratic Party was largely the dominant party, but there were rifts that were starting to take place in the Democratic Party that were kind of twisting and pulling them, largely based on this slavery issue. The Democrats were pretty much in agreement on everything else except this issue of slavery. There was some tension there, and the Whigs tended to be even more virulently, Northern Whigs tended to be even more violently opposed to slavery, and therefore there was even a greater rift between the Whigs, and the Whigs were becoming virtually a non-entity. They were unable to field candidates in two of the presidential elections in the 1850s. They were becoming a non-entity. So there were these rifts starting to take place. Parties like the Free Soil Party and the American Party, or the Know Nothing Party, are starting to make inroads here, and this is becoming a real problem. So also another issue that was going on was a rumor that gets started by a fellow by the name of James Burney, who referred to this as the slave power thesis, and his claim was that there was a small knot of slaveholders in the South that were pretty much controlling all of government. It was almost kind of a conspiracy theory. There were a good number of very powerful plantation owners in Congress, but there were powerful merchants and powerful businessmen and powerful lawyers and such also. So was the power of the slave aristocracy disproportionate? Well, that's up for debate. But either way, these guys do come out, they do start hammering a deal. This is kind of Henry Clay's last hurrah and Daniel Webster's last real hurrah. John C. Calhoun was largely opposed, but because of the efforts of these guys, we do end up getting the Compromise of 1850. And this Compromise of 1850 gave some concessions to the North. California was in fact admitted as a free state. And in exchange to the South, the New Mexico Territory and Utah Territory were going to be opened up under a term called popular sovereignty. It's probably important that I don't think I actually wrote this into the notes, but you might want to write this down. Popular sovereignty. I'm going to run out of room. Popular sovereignty was the belief that the people in a given territory should be the ones allowed to choose whether or not they want their territories to be slave states or not when they finally enter into the Union. So it was basically giving the vote. Whoever had the popular vote, pro-slavery or anti-slavery, would get to choose how they wanted to enter the country as a state, as either a free state or a slave state. So concessions would be that the New Mexico Territory and the Utah Territory would enter in not as states, but as territories open to popular sovereignty. They will not be bound by the Missouri Compromise, as the Louisiana Territory was going to be bound by the Missouri Compromise. Western Texas, you may have seen from the map in the last lecture, Texas was kind of strangely shaped. It's no longer shaped like that. Well, why? Well, because those western lands were then ceded to the New Mexico Territory as kind of a concession to the north, and in return, Texas was to receive $10 million, which they really kind of needed and wanted. Also, abolition. The slave trade was abolished in Washington, D.C. This was kind of a big deal. Now, don't misunderstand that. Slavery itself was not abolished in Washington, D.C., but the slave trade. You could no longer buy and sell your slaves in Washington, D.C., and probably the biggest concession to the South was a stronger Fugitive Slave Act. A slave act which brought the power of the federal government to bear. It basically said the federal government was going to intervene in fugitive slave cases, that the fugitive slave did have a right to a hearing, but did not have a right to actually speak or defend himself at that hearing, so you know how the hearing's going to go. And ultimately, people who were harboring fugitives could be forced to pay a penalty and serve a sanction as a result of their participation in harboring these slaves. This was something that the South had really wanted, this very strong Fugitive Slave Act. Well, yeah, there we go. Problem solved. Compromise of 1850. We're good. We're golden. We can go back to doing our thing now, making all our money. There's that California gold to get. Let's go for it. Oh, sorry guys, not going to be that easy. This is a map. This kind of gives you a breakdown of how the Missouri Compromise looked physically. In this case, you can kind of see how these territories being open to popular sovereignty is really benefited. It extends the possibility for slavery entering into the Utah Territory. Well, remember our buddy Stephen Douglas that we saw in an earlier slide? Well, he was a pretty good politician. He was referred to as the Little Giant. He was a very influential politician and a leader in the Senate. And well, he decided, you know what? There was a movement to build a transcontinental railroad that would extend, across the South. In fact, into California. In fact, land that had not been taken during the Mexican-American War turned out to be actually the best route for this Southern Railroad. So we ended up having to go back and buy that land that we did not conquer in the Mexican War. It's called the Gadsden Purchase. That's not good for Stephen Douglas. He was from Illinois. He wants something that's going to benefit Illinois. And you know what would really benefit Illinois would be a railroad linking Chicago to California. Right? That would be a much better idea for him and for Illinois. Remember, he is an Illinois senator. He wants to represent the interests of Illinois. He's also a major landholder who has a lot of real estate investments that would also benefit from the construction of a transcontinental railroad, which would raise the value of that real estate property. So he decides, hey, you know what? In order to get this railroad, we're going to have to organize this Nebraska territory. Well, this is a problem because, Southern politicians are not going to vote to have this Nebraska territory organized and create the possibility of bringing in a new possible free states. This territory would likely fill up relatively quickly. Southerners are not going to go for it. So, I'm Stephen Douglas. I have to figure out a way to convince Southerners to vote for organizing the Nebraska territory so I can build my railroad. What do I do? Hey, I know. They really liked the idea of popular sovereignty in Utah and New Mexico. How about we open up Nebraska to popular sovereignty? And here's what we will do. We will cut this territory. Let's see if I can erase this. So we will take this territory and we will cut it. And we will divide the territory. The southern portion of the territory will be the Kansas territory. The northern part of the territory will be the Nebraska territory. And both of these territories will be open to popular sovereignty. In other words, the people who live there will get to decide whether or not they want to be a free territory and consequently a free state or a slave territory. Now, the tendency is going to be obvious, right? The land speculators in Missouri who are slave owners, since the tendency has been to move westward, the Kansas territory will fill up with slave holders, and the Nebraska territory will fill up with free soil people, and we'd be able to maintain our balance in the Senate, and everything's good. What could possibly go wrong, right? So it turns out that Southerners did, in fact, like this idea. They never liked the Missouri Compromise and the 3630, so they voted for it. Southern Democrats are going to vote for it, of course, and even many Northern Democrats are going to go for it because they're kind of bound by their party to go for it, and Northern Democrats have a stronger affiliation with Western expansion, and Southern Whigs are going to go for it. However, Northern Whigs are not going to be happy about this idea. They're going to vote against, largely vote against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and this will be the final rift. As a consequence, what will ultimately happen is the Whig Party will literally disappear. They will. Many of the Southern Whigs are just going to abandon the party and join the Southern Democrats, and many of the Northern Whigs are either going to just leave and become part of the Northern Democrats, or they're just going to start to form their own political parties, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So the Northern Whigs, this is the end of the second party system, isn't it? The Northern Whigs will literally just disappear. That's why we don't have a real Whig party anymore, although they're... another consequence of this is that Northern Democrats are going to find themselves weakened. A lot of abolitionists are going to refuse to vote for Northern Democrats, and Northern Democrats are going to start losing seats in Congress, which is going to empower Southern Democrats. And consequently, those Northern Whigs and disaffected Northern Democrats are going to come together with the Know Nothing Party. We'll talk about later in a future lecture, and even some renegade socialists from Europe, and they're going to form a brand new party called the Republican Party. Among the Whigs who are going to become founding members of the Republican Party is one fellow by the name of Abraham Lincoln, you may have heard of, and we'll talk about him in the next lecture. Now, a major consequence of the Kansas-Nebraska Act is the Missouri Compromise no longer exists. The 3630 has been completely wiped out. There's no longer a Missouri Compromise to hold the country together and make decisions with regard to these territories. And another aspect of this is that for those people who were bought into or not quite bought into the slave power thesis, well, the fact that this Kansas-Nebraska Act eliminates the Missouri Compromise is going to kind of reinforce the slave power thesis. And that's going to be a real problem because now what's going to happen is Northerners are going to be less inclined to want to compromise with Southerners because it'll be an indication that they're caving into the slave power. And so there's this distrust now of both sides. Consequently, also Northerners refuse to participate in the Fugitive Slave Act, and Northern states refuse to allow any kind of intervention. They're not going to allow the Fugitive Slave Act to be enforced in their states. And this is going to cause major rifts among the Southerners. And, of course, abolitionists are absolutely going to be outraged by this. And there's going to be more for abolitionists to become outraged over. But hey, this land gets to be organized now, and we get our railroad. That's not bad, right? What could possibly go wrong? Well, yeah. Take a look at this fella here for a minute here. Now, let's say I were to say that this was going to be your substitute teacher for the next week. Yeah, you can kind of see what's going to go wrong here. This does not look like a mellow, carefree kind of guy. In fact, this is John Brown, and he is a radical militant abolitionist. He believes that you're not going to get rid of slavery in the United States without bloodshed, and the anti-slavery people should be the guys who draw blood first. All right, we need to actually start to go into battle over this slavery issue. And he is going to be encouraged, as are many other Northerners, by folks like Henry Ward Beecher, to go into Kansas and settle rather than going into Nebraska. So let's take a look at this map again, right? So now, instead of the assumption that Douglas was making, that we were going to have a simple westward movement. In fact, what folks like the minister Henry Ward Beecher and radicals like John Brown are saying is, let's, instead of doing this, let's do this and go into Kansas. So that, of course, inspires a lot of Southerners to say, well, wait a minute, Northerners are coming down into Kansas. We can't let that happen. We need to send our own guys up there into Kansas so that we can make sure that that land becomes good slave soil. And of course, these were referred to by Northerners who were going into Kansas as border ruffians coming up from the south to cause problems in Kansas, and there were indeed border ruffians who did just that. No, but that's not to say that the Northern abolitionists who were going down into Kansas were any less militant or any less ruffian-y. In fact, Henry Ward Beecher in his sermons suggested going down to Kansas with a Bible in one hand and a Sharps rifle in the other, and these Sharps rifles will become known as Beecher's Bibles. There was a lot of political skullduggery going on. In fact, in one case, the Free Soil people in Kansas, they very quickly get to vote for statehood. But is this going to be a Free Soil state or a slave state? Well, the Free Soilers refused to participate in and vote on what was called the Lecompton Constitution, a pro-slavery constitution written for the state of Kansas. They boycotted, and consequently they lost. But they had already voted on their own constitution for the state government that was a Free Soil constitution, and in fact, there were more Free Soilers in Kansas than there were slave soilers. So, if that's a term. So technically they should have, by virtue of popular sovereignty, they should have had their way. But the Lecompton Constitution was passed, was actually embraced by the President Buchanan at the time. Stephen Douglas did not like it. He did not want to see he seemed to believe in popular sovereignty and figured that the majority should decide. And the majority had clearly not decided in the Lecompton Constitution. It doesn't come to pass. But this kind of shows the element of the anger that was taking place during this time. These guys are going to start to get violent, of course. Everybody's bringing guns. They're also bringing alcohol. Guns, alcohol, and absolutist ideology doesn't mix very well. John Brown will earn his name as Potawatomi at Potawatomi Creek, in which he hacks to death about a family of 5 presumably slave soilers, but well, maybe not. But they were there. The city of Lawrence was burned down. A Free Soil city of Lawrence was burned down. There was a lot of violence. And this was known as Bleeding Kansas. And in fact, many historians of this particular time period place the beginning of the Civil War not in Virginia, Bull Run, 1861. No, they place the beginning of it in Kansas, 1854. Because this is where we actually start seeing Americans shooting at each other over the issue of slavery and over the issue of expansion. We also had the Dred Scott decision that came in and around this time. Absolutely outrages the abolitionist movement and actually makes a lot of people really think and question this idea of the slave power. Dred Scott was a slave. He and his owner had traveled and spent most of his time in free territory. Dred Scott will actually marry a free black woman, but of course she will have no say in the matter. If she's going to be married, she's going to have to go with Dred Scott back into slave territory, Missouri. And when they go in there, Dred Scott sues to be free, claiming that, hey, he was living in free territory for so many years that he must be a free citizen of that particular state. And, of course, that his wife was a free citizen. He sues. This goes all the way to the United States Supreme Court, in which the Chief Justice rules, the only matter in issue before the court, therefore, is whether the descendants of such slaves are citizens of a state, in the sense which the word citizen is used in the Constitution. We think that they are not. Under the citizens in the Constitution, not under the citizens of the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. So slaves were not citizens, slaves were property, and therefore as property they could no more have the right to sue their owners than, say, a cow or a sheep can sue his rulers. Well, you can imagine the abolitionist outrage at this. And even folks who are not necessarily so strongly drawn to the abolitionist cause at this point are saying, whoa, wait a minute. That's pretty deep. Dred Scott will be denied his right to freedom by the court, a divided court, by the way, as is often the case in these state cases. So we also have in 1857 an economic panic happened. This is the result of, well, before this time there was something called the Crimean War, Britain and France and Russia fighting in the Crimea, and consequently there was a huge spike in food prices, which was great for northern farmers who were shipping food. There was greater demand for food, and these northern farmers were making a lot of money, and consequently there was more speculation in these big companies that were selling food to Britain and France. Well, the Crimean War came to an end, and then Britain and France were able to make their own food. Yeah. And, well, this is going to cause prices of food to drop, which is going to cause a problem for a Ohio investment firm. The firm had invested heavily in food speculation, and they went belly up. And unfortunately, as a result of of a brand new invention called the telegram, Wall Street hears about the Ohio firm going belly up immediately, rather than hearing about it a couple weeks later and being able to kind of sort of deal with slow processing of information. So a lot of these investment firms that were invested in, they start to sell off and they start to dump their stocks, and then we start seeing all these firms dumping stocks, and then the Wall Street just kind of went bust, and they blew all of their values. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth as to how this has happened later on when we talk about the Great Depression, how these panics kind of happen. But this was the result. So consequently, there was a panic, and there was a brief economic crisis in the 1850s. But this economic crisis did not really affect the South, and did not affect the profits that were derived from cotton, leading a fellow by the name of James Henry Hammond to give the famous King Cotton speech, in which he says, "We have poured in upon you 1,600,000 bales of cotton, just at the moment to save you from destruction." And this is actually going to give Southerners pause and say, well, wait a minute, maybe we're better off. Here's a situation where the Northern economy turned to crud right in front of our faces, and our economy's doing just fine. Maybe we'll be better off on our own. And it's actually going to kind of increase and stir this secessionist idea that had been lingering around in the South for quite a few years. If that wasn't better, we also have senators and representatives beating each other up in Congress. Best C-SPAN ever, except it didn't exist at the time. But this was a case in which a very vicious-tongued orator like Charles Sumner had just gotten done ripping into a Southern colleague in the Senate, and when the cousin of this Southern colleague, a fellow by the name of Preston Brooks, heard about the dishonor that had taken place with his cousin. Preston Brooks was a representative right across the Capitol building. When he heard that this Yankee had insulted his cousin, he storms across the Capitol building and beats Charles Sumner on the head with his cane until he broke the cane and broke his head. And of course you can kind of see from this image, this is clearly a abolitionist piece, right? It definitely makes Sumner look sympathetic here in this image. Of course, this pen may very well have been tipped with poison. He was a rather vicious oral attacker in the Senate. once referring to one of his Southern colleagues as the spew and vomit of humanity. He was pretty rough, so he could probably get people angry. But that's not necessarily a reason to beat him in the head with a stick. Preston Brooks, by the way, as a result of this, became very, very popular in the South. People started sending him canes and walking sticks, rather, to replace the one that he had broken, and asked him to break more. Charles Sumner, in fact, is going to have to go to England to get medical treatment for his injuries, and will be gone for quite a while. He will, despite the fact that he is unable to serve in the Senate, the people of Massachusetts will re-elect him, and his seat will remain open and empty during the time that he was gone. He will come back for Reconstruction later on. Finally, just in case that wasn't bad enough, we get John Brown comes back. Of course, John Brown has to come back, right? John Brown comes back. He decides, you know what I'm going to do? I am going to lead a revolt. I am going to lead a slave revolt in the tradition of Spartacus of Rome, and I'm going to go and I'm going to liberate the slaves on a plantation, and then me and those slaves are going to then go to the next plantation and liberate those slaves, and we're going to arm them all, and then we're going to go plantation to plantation, killing all the plantation owners and liberating all of the slaves in the South. Ultimately, we will have a huge army of 3 million freed slaves, and it will be impossible to stop us. Well, good plan if you are a whack job. Frederick Douglass was approached with this plan, and Frederick Douglass said, no, that's not a good idea. This is not going to work. And in fact, it ended really, really badly. In order to get the weapons that he needed for this slave uprising, he attacked a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He's going to be surrounded by federal soldiers under the command of one Robert E. Lee, and he will ultimately be captured. His sons will be killed in the battle. John Brown will be put on trial, in which he makes a very prescient statement on the fact that this country is going to come to blows, and there is going to be bloodshed over this slavery issue. He is then going to be hanged, and in the process of being hanged, he will become a martyr to the abolitionist cause, as you can kind of see in this image here. This is, again, another abolitionist image that actually, the story is, of course, that as he was walking out of the court to the scaffold, he encountered a slave woman and her child, and he bent down and kissed the child that was kind of his last act before he left his mortal constraints. And of course, this image, I mean, if you really, really take a look at it, what is this image? This is almost a religious symbol. This is basically the Madonna. I don't think this writes when I have it. No, it doesn't. So, I mean, this image here, this is basically almost your Madonna and child imagery, which of course would then put, put him in what kind of light. So he is going to be executed, and the cause is going to, he becomes a martyr to the abolitionist cause, but he is absolutely a venomous serpent as far as the South is concerned. The fact that John Brown was going to conduct this raid seemed to be proof positive to Southerners that the North would stop at nothing to end slavery, and the distrust and the absolute hatred and anger toward each other are going to come to blows. This is not going to end well. And next lecture, we're going to actually see the beginnings. We're going to learn how the Civil War itself started, and the opening sequences of the Civil War. So, hey, I managed to keep it under 40 minutes. I didn't think I was going to be able to do that. You're welcome.